Genesis's first apocalypse, the Tohu Wabohu cataclysm. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's the first line of the Bible, maybe the most famous opening sentence ever written. For generations, we've pictured a divine architect speaking a perfect universe into existence from nothing. The story is foundational, familiar, and seems pretty straightforward. But the very next verse throws a wrench in that pristine image. It describes the newly created earth with a dark and mysterious phrase. It says the planet was formless and void, and that darkness was over the face of the deep. But what if that gentle, poetic translation hides a far more chaotic reality? The original Hebrew is Tohu Wabohu, and in the only other places it appears in the Bible, it doesn't mean unformed. It describes a desolate, chaotic, and catastrophic ruin. This raises a chilling question. What if the story we've always been told isn't about the first creation? What if Genesis chapter 1 is actually the story of a cleanup operation after the first apocalypse? Section 1. The Anomaly of the Abyss. To dig into this, we have to look closer at Genesis 1:2. The traditional take is that God first created the raw materials of the universe, which existed in a chaotic, watery, and unorganized state before he started the 6 days of shaping and ordering it. It's a primordial soup, just waiting for the divine chef. This is the view held by the vast majority of biblical scholars, who see Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 as one continuous story describing the starting point of the cosmos. But a deep mystery is hidden in those Hebrew words, Tohu Wabohu. While formless and void is the standard translation, this exact phrase is incredibly rare, appearing only 3 times in the entire Old Testament. To get its true weight, we have to play detective and see where else it's used. Our first clue is in the book of the prophet Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 4, the prophet sees a terrifying vision of God's judgment. He describes total devastation, and in verse 23 he says, "I looked on the earth, and behold, it was Tohu Wabohu." Here the phrase doesn't describe a world waiting to be made. It describes a world that has been unmade, a land obliterated by divine judgment and reduced to a wasteland. The pattern continues. In Isaiah chapter 34, the prophet describes God's judgment on the nations, declaring that the Lord will stretch over the land the measuring line of Tohu and the plumb line of Bohu. This is the language of absolute desolation, the result of a cataclysm. In both cases, Tohu Wabohu is the aftermath of destruction, not the raw material for creation. Proponents of a hidden history in Genesis ask a simple question. If the phrase means a ruin caused by judgment everywhere else, why would it mean something totally different in Genesis? Of course, this is an interpretation, not a consensus. Most scholars argue that the context of Genesis 1 is unique. They say that while the phrase later got linked with judgment, its original meaning was just to describe a state of being unordered and uninhabited, waiting for God to bring life and structure. Still, the question lingers. Could the Bible's opening act be hiding a scene of destruction in plain sight? Section 2. When was becomes became. The plot thickens when we zoom in on a single tiny verb. Genesis 1:2 in English reads, "And the earth was without form and void." The Hebrew verb here is haya, and this is where the second big piece of the puzzle clicks into place. The verb haya can be tricky. While it often means was, it can also be translated as became or came to pass, depending heavily on the context. This grammatical possibility isn't really disputed. But whether it applies to Genesis 1:2 is a huge debate. For those who see a catastrophe between the first two verses of the Bible, this translation changes everything. If you go with this alternate meaning, the verse is transformed. It no longer reads, "The earth was formless and void." Instead, it reads, "The earth became formless and void." This isn't a simple description of a starting point anymore. It's the description of a changed condition. It implies a sequence. First, in Genesis 1:1, God creates a perfect heaven and earth. Then, something terrible happens. And as a result, the earth became a desolate ruin, a tohu wabohu. This interpretation is the core of the gap theory, the idea that a vast, unwritten period of time exists between the Bible's first and second verses. But it's important to know this is a highly speculative reading. The overwhelming consensus of Hebrew scholars and nearly all modern translations stick with was. They argue that the grammar of the sentence strongly supports was, and translating it as became is a choice made to fit a theory, not a conclusion the text demands. Still, for believers in the theory, this translation opens a door to a lost chapter of cosmic history. Section 3. The motive for destruction. Okay, so if we entertain this idea for a minute and assume the earth became a ruin, the next question is obvious. What could have caused God to judge the world before humanity even existed? The six-day creation that follows is all about order, life, and goodness. What dark event could have come before it? To find a possible motive, investigators of this theory look at two of the most mysterious passages in the Old Testament, Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. On the surface, these chapters are taunts aimed at human kings, the king of Babylon and the king of Tyre. But the language used to describe them seems to fly far beyond any mortal ruler. Ezekiel 28 describes a being who was in Eden, the garden of God, covered in precious stones. It calls him the anointed cherub who covers, who was perfect in your ways from the day you were created, till iniquity was found in you. This just doesn't sound like any human king. For centuries, a major theological tradition has interpreted this as a hidden reference to Lucifer before his fall from grace. Isaiah 14 paints a similar picture, describing a figure who says in his heart, "I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will make myself like the Most High." This has also been traditionally seen as the prideful boast that led to Satan's rebellion. Proponents of the gap theory connect these dots to create a blockbuster narrative. They suggest God's original creation in Genesis 1:1 was a perfect world, and Lucifer was its angelic guardian. But his pride led to a rebellion in heaven, a cosmic war that scarred the universe. God's judgment against that rebellion, they argue, was the cataclysm that destroyed the original world, throwing it into the dark, watery, ruined state of tohu wabohu. This event, sometimes called Lucifer's flood, would have been the first great apocalypse. Again, we have to weigh the evidence. Mainstream biblical scholarship urges caution. Most scholars argue these passages in Ezekiel and Isaiah are complex, symbolic digs at the pride of human rulers. Applying them to Satan is a later Christian interpretation, and linking that to a supposed pre-Adamic destruction is another leap, a theory built on a theory. It's not something the text ever explicitly states. Section 4. A world that perished. If this theory is right, then the gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 isn't a pause, but a chasm of time hiding a lost age. It would have been a world that existed before Adam, possibly filled with life and then utterly wiped out. This is where the theory tries to solve another great mystery: the fossil record and an Earth that science says is billions of years old. The gap theory suggests that the fossils of dinosaurs and other prehistoric life aren't from Noah's flood, but are the remains of this original pre-Adamic world. The cataclysm of Lucifer's rebellion destroyed them, and the earth lay dormant and ruined for ages before God began the six-day recreation described from Genesis 1:3 onward. As possible scriptural backup, theorists point to 2 Peter 3:5-6. The Apostle Peter writes about scoffers who forget that, by the word of God, the heavens existed long ago, and an earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world of that time was deluged and perished. Proponents say the world of that time refers to this pre-Adamic world destroyed by Lucifer's flood. However, this is once again a minority view. The vast majority of scholars are convinced this passage is a clear reference to the world before Noah's flood, the event described later in Genesis. And the gap theory runs into a huge theological problem. The Bible states in Romans 5:12 that death entered the world through Adam's sin. A pre-Adamic world filled with life, death, violence, and destruction seems to directly contradict this core principle of Christian theology. For many, it's a puzzle piece that just won't fit. Conclusion. So where does that leave us? Our investigation started with two strange Hebrew words and led us down a rabbit hole of grammatical debates, prophetic visions, and a hunt for a cosmic war. We've uncovered the gap theory, an idea that suggests a lost apocalypse is hidden in the Bible's opening lines. It pieces together clues from Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel to build a story of a perfect world, destroyed by angelic pride, that became the formless void God would later reshape into our world. This theory is a fascinating attempt to reconcile faith with things like the fossil record and an ancient Earth. It paints a picture of a universe with a history far deeper and more violent than many of us ever imagined. But it remains a controversial and speculative idea, a minority view that clashes with centuries of mainstream scholarship and raises as many theological questions as it tries to answer. It doesn't give us definitive proof, but it does offer a new, thought-provoking lens. It invites us to read the familiar words of Genesis and wonder what other secrets might be lying in wait, just beneath the surface of the text. What do you think? Does this interpretation change how you read the creation story? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to explore more hidden mysteries from the ancient world, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation.